Have you got a waiting room, or are they? Oh, thank you so much for having me. And it's wonderful to see so many people. And I would just like to thank Michelle for setting this up as a meeting. As you probably know, Zoom does meetings and it does webinars. And the thing I love about meetings is I get to see at least some of the people who are attending, which is always wonderful, because then you can really feel that there is actually an audience. And sometimes with webinars, when it's just the speakers, you can feel a little bit like you're speaking into a vast empty space of the digital world. So it's lovely to see you all, literally, to actually see your faces. And I'll be sort of giving a bit of an overview of, what is Ecocide, where has the campaign got to, and how is it developing, and so on. And of course, this is unlike the Australian Earth Law Association. Our focus is very, very narrow and very, very specific. Our campaign exists effectively to promote and facilitate the recognition of ecocide at the international level, so at the level of an international crime. And we think of it almost as a kind of a very strategic intervention, almost like an acupuncture needle, in terms of it's a very, very specific thing, but we believe it is also an incredibly powerful thing to bring into being. But before I go more into what Ecocide is, I'd just like to begin by saying that this week.
Sorry, folks, there seems to be a little hiccup. Jojo should be back any minute now. The joys of international communication. I assume she's frozen for everyone. She's frozen for me. Yeah. I'm sure she'll be back any minute, and we'll have to ask her to start from where we lost her. Perhaps to fill the void. She's dropped out. Hopefully she'll come back. What I might mention while we wait for Jojo to come back in is I'd like to see, John, you're on tonight, aren't you? I can see you there. Is Rob White on? I might just introduce to you all the Australian team who are starting to pick up an Australian branch for the Stop Ecocide International. I'm sorry, guys and girls, I know that you all signed up to listen to Jojo, not us. But John, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself from Perth so folks know who you are?
Okay, well, my name is John, and I came about Ecocide a few months ago, where I took the reins, I took the lead, and copied the international Ecocide logos, and kicked off the Twitter feed in Australia. And I got an email back from Jojo's team saying, you shouldn't be doing this, this is copyright. But while you're here, how about doing this? So that's my background on Ecocide.
A cheerful story. Whereas my story is I was realising that we were promoting discussions about Ecocide through our Australian People's Tribunal, and also through some of our other local work and discussions. So I reached out to Jojo, who we already knew from previous events and gatherings and discussions. So we've all been connected, and also to Rob White, who's quite a well-known green criminology expert down in Tasmania. So the three of us, plus my wonderful helper at the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, young lawyer and groovy person, Christina Myers. So perhaps while we wait for Jojo to join, I might just put our email address in there. If you would like to find out more about what we'll be up to help connect Australia to the Stop Ecocide International campaign, do send us an email, ayla@earthlaws.org.au. I've been checking the emails and any messages in any form from any platform to see where Jojo has disappeared to. Hopefully she'll come back in a minute. Just check one more time. And rather than ramble at you like an endless advert for Ayla, I could even invite you all to go and get a cup of tea, because it's that kind of evening, I suspect. What have we got? No.
Or a glass of wine.
Oh, a glass of wine, even more sensible. Absolutely. So look, folks, there's no sign of her returning just yet. If you are in dire need to go and get something to eat, or something to drink, please go now. I'll make sure when she comes back, we'll have a chat and we'll kick off again at 6:20. And if we don't see her from then, we might have to reschedule the webinar, which is a shame. All right, I'm going to put myself on mute, although, hang on, someone in the waiting room. Let me have a look. Yes, there she is. Hooray. I've just sent 4 people. I just saw 4 people go off, so I'll have to wait a bit. I've let her in. Are you there, Jojo?
Oh my goodness.
Are you okay? Did you get lost in the ether?
No, you wouldn't believe what just happened. I've just been crawling around under the piano because it turns out that one of our cats had basically dislodged the electrical connection from our router.
Oh my goodness. See, it's Mother Nature fighting back.
Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. I'm so embarrassed.
It's okay. I was worried I'd done something, but I was checking no one else had dropped off. So
I had to do this rapid thing around the house. I was like, okay, so is there a power cut? What is it that's not working?
Oops. Now your video. There we go. Wonderful.
Okay.
Jojo,
yeah, sorry about
okay.
that.
No, it's okay. Don't feel embarrassed at all. Most of the friends, we're very laid back. It's in the evening. I told them if they needed to go and grab something to eat or get a cup of tea, that we'd give them a because I wasn't sure. I also plugged the new team of folks here in Australia who are supporting the Stop Ecocide International from the Australian branch, and we've given them our email address. So yeah, Christina's saying we're Aussies, we're pretty chilled out. Don't stress, it's all good.
Oh my goodness! Well, thank you so much. Glad to be back.
I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, so as I was saying, I sort of wonder whether actually that was, Polly had an extraordinarily mischievous sense of humour, and I just wonder whether, how sort of bringing her up in the conversation, she thought she'd have a little intervention there, but yeah, so yes, her departure was very, very rapid, unexpected. She'd had a sort of a chest infection for some time, and we had no idea that it was as serious as it was. And by the time they diagnosed the cancer, they basically said, look, you're already beyond our help. So and they gave her a very brief 6 weeks as a prognosis at the time. And in fact, she didn't even quite make that. So it was about a month from her diagnosis to when she passed away on the 21st of April, which that year was Easter Day. So a bit like how in the UK, the Queen has 2 birthdays, Polly most years actually has 2 anniversaries of passing, because one is Easter Day and one is on the 21st. But the other sort of, I mean, it was an extraordinary moment, obviously, for me personally, in the sense that she was my dearest friend and closest colleague. And that was quite an extraordinary sort of experience to go through, not least because what I inherited from her was literally a global campaign. And when she became ill, there was a strong response from her family. She had this a worldwide following, and of course, many, many messages that we received talking about, how sad and shocking it was, and what was going to happen to this work if she passed away, and actually, people being afraid that somehow the work would die with her, and actually, literally the opposite happened, which was quite extraordinary. And it was almost as if, and sometimes I think this happens when you have a strong figurehead for a particular initiative. And as I'll go on to explain, she was by no means the only person working on this, but she was the very sort of visible beacon for it, if you like. Sometimes what happens is that people tend to think that they don't really need to do anything because that person's, they've already got it. It's that's Polly's thing. She's doing that. And of course, when she was no longer there, what actually happened was people started to get in touch with me as her closest associate and say, how can we help you to make sure this work continues? How can we make sure that this happens? And so what's happened since has been extraordinary, because it's been a kind of it's a whole 2 years of what has felt to me almost like a massive dot joining exercise of kind of collaboration and realizing campaigns elsewhere and lawyers elsewhere and politicians and diplomats, and kind of bringing all of those connections together, so that actually what we're looking at now is a really fast growing global movement. And I have to say, it very much feels like the spirit of Polly is kind of with it, is almost expanded, you know, by her sort of not being restricted to one sort of place and time in some way. And yeah, that's been really quite an extraordinary experience. And I think there was also another aspect, which I'm sure you'll all relate to as well, and which also is kind of particularly poignant this week. And that was that the last week of Polly's life was also the week of the Extinction Rebellion in London, the April Rebellion in 2019. And that was the first time that Polly's call to stop ecocide, if you like, you know, was actually sort of hit the streets, in a sense of, you know, there were, you know, people carrying stop ecocide placards across the rebellion. And the first action that kicked off the rebellion was an action taken by by a small group of rebels, mostly from Stroud, which is where I live and where Polly lived. And it's also the birthplace of Extinction Rebellion. And there was a small group of 7 who took an action at the Shell building, the Shell headquarters in London. And they dedicated it to Polly, who at the time obviously was very ill. And this week, they are actually on trial in London for that action. So 2 years later, because of COVID and everything, all the, you know, the backlog of court cases and all of that means that it's only now that they're actually in court. And it's this extraordinary sort of poignancy of it being exactly 2 years. It'll be 2 years, I think, tomorrow, since the action itself. And for us as a campaign for Stop Ecocide, it was incredibly important, because it kind of, if you like, it sort of kicked off that grassroots, you know, sort of public awareness. And also for Polly, it was hugely important because she, you know, she saw her message hitting the streets for the first time. And I remember she was in a hospice by then. And I remember her watching the footage, you know, that was coming out on the media, that was coming out on Facebook, and her saying to me, "Oh, Jojo," she said, "you know, it's all going to happen now," she said. And it was like she kind of knew that moment was sort of the beginning of a whole new phase in this work that she had championed for so long. And it was really quite remarkable, because I never saw her afraid. I never saw her upset for what was happening to her. She was absolutely, to the end, absolutely committed to what she had dedicated herself to in life, and making sure that you know, that continued. And so seeing that happen on the streets of London was absolutely, you know, it was deeply important to her. And yeah, so and I think that the growth that we've seen over the last 2 years in people's awareness of what ecocide is, and of the possibility of criminalizing ecocide, has had a lot to do with the climate mobilizations. So the Extinction Rebellion, but not just Extinction Rebellion, of course, Greta Thunberg's inspired school strikes, and, you know, elsewhere, movements that may come up under other names, like the Sunrise Movement in the US, for example. But that kind of on the streets awareness and protest and disruption has created, over the last couple of years, a kind of a window. It's sort of expanded the window of what the media are prepared to talk about, and also what the politicians are having their attention drawn to, so that now the climate and ecological emergency is effectively, you know, it's a living room conversation. And that simply wasn't the case 2 years ago. And what that's meant for us is that there's a kind of, there's a space into which we can speak this demand, we can speak this concept of criminalizing ecocide, and have it heard in a way that was always an uphill struggle for the many years that Polly and others championed this. So that was, you know, it was an incredibly important moment. So to sort of go to speak to some of the sort of basic information around what we're doing. The first thing people ask, of course, is what do we mean by ecocide? I mean, quite simply, it's very broadly understood as mass damage and destruction of nature, of serious harm to nature, serious harm to ecosystems. And much as the way that, you know, homicide is killing a person, or genocide is destroying a people, so ecocide is the destruction of nature. But unlike those other crimes, ecocide is not, for the most part, in most of the world, recognized as a crime. So we all know that you can't go to a government and request a permit to slaughter a few hundred people for your new business because, hey, it's going to be good for jobs. Because, of course, that's criminal. And it sits well below the moral red line that we all draw, and that particularly in the Western paradigm, we draw with criminal law. With activities that can lead to ecocide, that's not the case. Not only are they often permitted, but they're often licensed. So you can go and get a license for deep sea fishing. And some of those methods can destroy entire swathes of the seabed. The same is true of of hydrocarbon extraction of various kinds, whether that's fracking, whether that's oil extraction, and so on. And that's not to say that necessarily every single instance of doing those things is ecocidal, but at its worst, those are often the industries that are creating ecocides. And so, effectively, we still don't culturally put destruction of nature in the same bracket as destruction of people. And we have, a very long-standing mindset of separation between humanity and the natural world, which is, actually, while I came to this work myself through direct on-the-ground activism, and I think if you'd asked me a few years ago, who would you like to see in the dock for Ecocide, I could have given you quite a long list. But what we're realizing is that this is, what we're aiming to do with criminalizing ecocide is to create a deterrent by putting the whole concept of seriously destroying nature into that same moral bracket, so that we're actually having people understand it to be criminal. And so ultimately what we're aiming to do is deter the practices. We're aiming to change corporate practice and to change government policy. And criminal law has an ability to do this that civil litigation doesn't. And that's not to say that civil litigation is not important. It's hugely important. And actually there are now upwards of 1,700 climate litigation cases alone in the world, and plenty more in the environmental arena. And what those cases do is hugely important. It creates huge banks of evidence. It can, in the best cases, create compensation and some sense of justice. And of course, importantly, it also names and shames those who are behaving badly. But what it doesn't have the same capacity to do as a criminal law is actually change practices, because corporations tend to budget for it. So if you change environmental regulation, which is where not all but most environmental law sits in the regulatory sphere, if you change regulation, what you tend to change is, the balance sheet and the budgeting. How much do we need to set aside for external costs? And effectively, court cases and compensation claims are seen as part of engaging in business. And so, while, as I say, limited justice can potentially be achieved that way, and a lot of very important, public relations information can happen that way, and evidence gathering, what you're not doing is actually changing behavior, because of course it's easier and cheaper, more profitable to just continue in the same old. However, if you approach this from a criminal perspective, you're actually creating individual, personal criminal liability. And in the case of where we're aiming for, which is at the international level, in particular, putting it at the level of an atrocity crime alongside war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, what you're doing is you're aiming that at the key decision makers. So one of the things we often get asked is, am I committing ecocide by driving my fossil fuel car? Now, obviously, there is a way in which we are all contributing to the situation with air pollution, to the situation with climate change, and potentially other things that cumulatively could be seen as an ecocide. However, I think it's interesting to note that the corporate PR machine has done a wonderful job over the last 20 years or so of convincing Joe Public that we are all responsible individually for what is happening to the planet. And that is hugely misleading. Because while it's absolutely fundamentally important that we do think about our carbon footprints and that we do make conscious choices with our purchases and so on, because that does make a difference, that pressure does make a difference, and it's absolutely important. What that whole narrative doesn't acknowledge is the fact that most of us probably drive fossil fuel cars because that's all we can afford. And because that is what is subsidized by governments, and so the decisions that are made at policy level and at industry level, and the lobbying and the all of that sort of top level decision making is not something that is a consumer choice. As citizens, we are offered certain options. And so effectively, I think it's important to sort of separate those two things. And of course, by aiming at the top level in criminalizing ecocide, what we're aiming to do is speak to those top decision makers about their own potential personal liability criminal liability for serious damage to nature. And what that does is it creates a level of enforceable deterrence that is currently not present. And effectively, in the area of corporate activity, which is where most serious damage to nature is occurring, is as a result of corporate practices, we have an interesting situation where criminalizing ecocide potentially has an even stronger deterrent effect than the crimes that are already designated as most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, which is a quote from the Rome Statute, the governing document of the International Criminal Court. That's the level of crime that document deals with. And the reason I say this is that a CEO cares very deeply about the public image. They have to, because their share price, their stock value, their public and investor confidence depends on it. And so they don't want to be seen as criminals. They're not going to want to be in the same dock as a war criminal or a genocidal maniac, who may care very little about their public relations, but the CEO cares a lot. And so what that means is that you're actually creating a level of caution and deterrence in that, by doing that is potentially really quite powerful with ecocide in particular. And so that sort of gives you a little bit of a flavour of the power of criminalising ecocide. I'd like to say a little bit about why we aim specifically at the international level. There are a number of reasons, but there are sort of three key reasons. The first one is a sort of practical legal one, in the sense that the International Criminal Court, which, as you probably know, is based at The Hague, and it has currently 123 member states. So not all the world, but sort of, knocking on 2/3 of the world have signed up to the Rome Statute, which governs those crimes at the ICC. That court is the only global mechanism which directly accesses the criminal justice systems of all its member states. So it's not like a separate court, like the Court of Human Rights, it isn't governed, like many treaties have, either don't have a specific jurisdiction, or they have a separate court or something like that. Now, with the ICC, there's a direct access to the criminal justice systems that already exist. So if you make something a crime there, any country ratifying that crime must include it in their own domestic legislation, meaning that a crime that is described there goes wholesale into the domestic legislation of ratifying countries. So what that means is it's the most coherent way to create a law that applies across borders in the same way. And that is actually very important with serious environmental crime, because it tends to be the worst offenders tend to be transnational corporations and their supply chains. Those corporations are often able to sort of hop jurisdictions according to where the laws and regulations are less stringent and so on. So having a crime that can be adopted in a similar form across many jurisdictions is hugely practical in this circumstance. The second reason is we've touched on already, which is a kind of the sort of cultural / moral aspect of this, which is that if you go to the top, if you like, and the Rome Statute is ultimately the most powerful enforceable document in the world in terms of law, what you're doing by doing that is you're saying that destroying nature is on a par with destroying people. Now, we do sometimes have a little bit of resistance to that idea. Are you saying that, Amazon deforestation is equivalent to the Holocaust, for example? But of course, when we look at the deadly serious consequences that we're observing happening in ever more apocalyptic ways around the world, what we see is that this kind of most serious crime of concern to the international community is very much there in reality in terms of the effects of serious damage to nature, because what we're looking at is not just and I say this with full awareness of the weight of it, not just destroying a people in whole or in part, but potentially threatening the whole of human civilization as we know it if we continue down this particular path with this attitude. And so there's a way in which in reality ecocide it does is a most serious crime of concern to humanity as a whole, but also putting it in that position does a kind of a readjustment as to how we see ourselves in relation to nature. And you'd be amazed how many people sometimes need reminding that what we breathe, what we eat, what we drink, what we build our houses, all of this is absolutely directly dependent upon the ecosystems and the health of the ecosystems around us. And so there's a way in which that kind of cultural and moral shift can be assisted by approaching this at the international level. And then the third reason, which is hugely important actually, is a political reason, and actually on one level an economic one as well. And that is that legislating for ecocide jurisdiction by jurisdiction is quite scary for governments. And we've found that governments are actually often quite reluctant to sort of stick their necks out and be the first on the block. And while we now have 8 member states of the ICC that have expressed publicly recorded an interest to varying degrees in amending the Rome Statute in this way, so in this particular initiative, none of those has actually said, we're going to be first on the block doing this. So there's a kind of safety in numbers feeling about accumulating the support at the international level. And where that has been attempted and is being attempted, it's very interesting to see what's happening. And France is an interesting kind of pilot case almost in this, because they have been attempting to legislate nationally for ecocide. They do also quite vocally support the idea of criminalizing ecocide at the international level. And if you look at what the French government has been saying, it's actually quite easy to see that they're much more comfortable with the idea of criminalizing at the international level, because criminalizing at the national level has a kind of immediacy to it that means that the corporate sector is all kind of, oh my goodness, do we really have to deal with this? And what's actually ended up happening is that the term ecocide has been watered down quite a lot in order to potentially get it passed at the at the national level, at the domestic level in France. And that's been obviously very disappointing for campaigners and for the Citizens' Assembly who really kind of pushed this move in France. But I think what it shows quite clearly is that criminalizing ecocide on an immediate basis, which of course is easier at the domestic level, you can effectively, a government could decide overnight to introduce a law. But I think we can fairly honestly say that if this came in overnight, almost anywhere, it would be very, very chaotic and difficult to manage if we put it at the level that we would actually like to see it. And what we believe at the Stop Ecocide campaign is that we need to bring everybody with us on this. We don't actually want this to be a situation of let's instantly demonize all of these people who are doing, who are destroying the environment in this way. Not because it wouldn't be great to have that recognized, but because actually we want all of those people to change their practices. We don't want to clog up the courts and confuse all the politicians and alienate every economic operator by suddenly introducing something that is so new to the sort of legal arena that it's really hard to deal with. what we need is a period. It shouldn't be a long period. We haven't got long, but they need some time. Governments need some time. The corporate sector needs some time to adjust, to follow compliance pathways, to put in place transition policies, for all of this to kind of begin to steer, to act as a course correction and as a kind of a guardrail. So what we're wanting to put in place is a parameter, which is literally like a safety rail for humanity. So it's a safety rail that that corporations can then see as a parameter and see approaching over the horizon. And if you do this at the international level, that's actually much easier, because firstly, governments know that they need to get they need a lot of other countries to be in on it as well, for there to be a kind of safety in numbers factor. And of course, we need the numbers in order to pass this at the international level. You need at least 2/3 of members of the International Criminal Court. But what that does is it puts it on the agenda. It has the conversation being discussed at the international level and at the national level, and as far as we're concerned, anywhere and everywhere. And what that does is it creates in the conversation around policy making and around, for example, investment and insurance, looking at, a few years. So we might be saying, for example, it might be 5 years. We say, I mean, we're kind of estimating approximately a 5-year trajectory for this, which is ambitious, but we think it's possible. You're then looking at governments seeing this coming, at corporations seeing this coming, and being able to kind of steer the way that they approach their practices, so that they're putting in place ways of complying with the new law, and making sure that they're not going to fall foul of it. So we completely support anyone that wants to push this at the national level, but what we would say is we would recommend actually including a transition period in that campaign, because that way we're far more likely to actually gather the momentum and bring everybody with us, because it's, we're all in this together. This is not a boat where you can point at the other end and say the leak is over there. This is something that we need to bring everybody with us on. So this is another important reason why our campaign specifically aims for the international level. And because it's actually, interestingly, I mean, politically, for us, we feel it's a win-win, in the sense that it can be a good first step for governments to say, well, we may not be ready to do this quite yet ourselves, but we're willing to support it at the international level. Now, our positioning as the Stop Ecocide campaign and foundation is an interesting one, in that we're right in the middle of the legal developments, which I'll go on to in a moment before we open for questions, but the political developments, so the diplomatic traction, and a lot of our core work actually happens behind closed doors with state representatives and so on, but also the public narrative. So what that means is that we have the ability to, in a way, to both to kind of, to have those different arenas interact with each other, because we're at a point of having the knowledge in all of those areas and being able to really build on the opportunities that arise. So when President Macron, for example, last June, included as part of his speech of acknowledgement to the French Citizens' Assembly, who had brought him a whole range of climate policies, we were able to seize on what he'd said about ecocide and use that as a lever in terms of amplifying it, and then having that move, that information move out to other states. And I can promise you that directly led to political interest from a number of other states. And so, this ability, if you like, to build the narrative is proving itself to be possibly the key factor in moving this work forward at the international level. So what we're realizing is that, and particularly with recent media, which, as you may have noticed, has become quite global now, in the sense that we've had very sympathetic pieces in publications like Time Magazine, The Economist, Politico, the American Network News last week. I mean, just some remarkable coverage. And what this shows is that the conversation is beginning to have a life of its own. And that's something that we can all, I mean, literally everybody here in this webinar, as well as, all of our campaigns globally, can help to accelerate that conversation. Because what we're seeing is that where we have communication teams on the ground, as Michelle's been explaining, there's one now growing in Australia, where we have communication teams on the ground, the political dial is moving faster, quite noticeably. So, you know, it's not an absolute correlation, but it's quite a close correlation between the countries where we have communication teams on the ground and the countries that are showing an interest at the political level. So what that says to us is that the conversation around this is the fundamental factor. The fact that people on the ground, in their language, in their culture, are using this word and are applying it to situations that they can see, and pushing that dial is really making the key difference. So that's been a hugely encouraging and empowering thing to realize that actually, and this is one of the things that Polly struggled with, I have to say, is that people would admire what she was doing, but it felt incredibly remote. For a lot of people, you know, law is kind of over there somewhere. Criminal law is sort of, you know, even further away, and international criminal law might as well be on the moon. But what we're discovering is that actually, you know, ordinary citizens and NGOs, corporations, grassroots groups, campaigns, all of those people talking about ecocide actually makes a concrete difference at the political level. It really does, and we can see it very clearly. And I think that, you know, my last point on that is that the word itself is very important, because we all have this understanding that serious damage is happening to nature in lots of different areas. And the word ecocide brings that together. So it's like, this is all serious destruction of nature. And so there's a concept that brings that together. And of course, once you understand that concept, almost automatically, you know that it's wrong and it needs to stop. So just the word itself carries its own snowball effect. And that's really powerful. And you can see this easily if you just compare it to, I mean, there's a wonderful treaty that's been being discussed in the UN for some years on transnational corporations and their effects on human rights violations and environmental damage. But what it's known as colloquially is the legally binding treaty, which tells you absolutely nothing about what it's actually doing. And so, you know, just to give you a contrast as to, you know, we have this huge advantage of this concept and this word that has its own momentum. And so that's another really important factor. And finally, I'd just like to give a bit more of an update around the political and legal developments as they're happening now. So as I mentioned, we already have 8 countries that have a publicly recorded interest in this. Vanuatu and the Maldives were the first to actually bring it up at the International Criminal Court and request that member states consider it. And that took the whole conversation onto another level. So, you know, we were working behind the scenes, you know, strategically and supportively with small island states for some time, for 3 years before that time was reached, when those countries felt able and had the courage to stand up and call for that. And then another big jump happened with the support of Emmanuel Macron in France as the first sort of, you know, Western head of state to support this. And that was then closely followed by Belgium in terms of motions going into Parliament, but then by October with their government pledges. And there's also been recorded support from Finland, Spain, Canada, and Luxembourg in different degrees. But what we also now have, and you possibly have come across the Ecocide Alliance, which is an alliance of parliamentarians across the world. And I know that there are Australian members of that alliance. Where there are parliamentarians from a lot more countries who are very interested in the emergence of the definition that is currently being worked on by this legal panel that our foundation has convened. And so we already know that there is a kind of warm table onto which to drop this definition when it emerges, if you like. And I suppose the other thing that I wanted to finish with is the progress of the drafting panel. Now, obviously, the exact content of those discussions is confidential, but I just came out of one of the full panel sessions yesterday feeling enormously excited and inspired, not necessarily because they've come to a conclusion already. There's still a way to go, and there's very lively discussion. And you know, it's quite likely that with you know, because the Rome Statute has its own sort of legal language and its own particular sort of restrictions, if you like, in terms of what it can and can't do. So, you know, what emerges is unlikely to cover absolutely everything that you or I might want it to cover. However, what I realize is that this is, you know, it almost, you know, assuming that some kind of decent definition emerges from it, which I'm sure it will, because we really have some top minds on it. The campaign itself and the conversation, the global conversation itself, is as important as the legal definition, because what at the level of the legal discussion and involving states and sort of evolving that conversation so that becomes sort of as prominent and as it needs to be at the level of the International Criminal Court to move that forward as an amendment. That's one side of that. That's just one side of the story. And I think the sort of realization that really came to me in that meeting yesterday was that it is the story. It's about it, it's the story that we tell. And simply the fact that states are now taking this seriously, that there is the possibility of creating an environmental crime at the highest level, which currently is relegated to one subclause under war crimes and has never been used, but to actually give it the status of a crime of its own, that is so powerful. And what we're seeing in terms of the conversation arising in response to this movement in the different sectors, where whether, and that can be, that's the business sector, but it's also government policy, and potentially the sort of knock-on effect on the enforcement of existing environmental laws is actually a huge part of this. Because right now, one of the biggest problems with environmental law is it's not hugely well enforced, in many parts of the world. And that we believe is strongly to do with the fact that damage to nature is simply not perceived to be as serious as damage to people or as damage to property. Of course, a lot of our law focuses around property. And so the very fact that there will be a crime that is acknowledged at the international level is we're already seeing the noises happening of people beginning to take much more seriously environmental legislation as a whole. And so, it just made me realize that this is it's an incredibly exciting and kind of bridging point that we're at. And in terms of the timing of this, it's hugely important, because we all know that the Paris targets and the Sustainable Development Goals are not going to be met by even the sort of interim stages at kind of 2030 or so, are not going to be met unless something more concrete, a more concrete parameter is put in place to create the steer that is needed. And that is what we're seeing building here, and I think that's hugely exciting. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and let's just see what people would like to engage in more in terms of ongoing conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jojo. There, I can see some air clapping going on, which is wonderful. I think we'll probably have a terrific discussion. Before we start that discussion, Jojo, I was just wondering if, perhaps for those who are new to the more detailed nuances of how you define ecocide, what's the kind of standard way that folks define? I know Polly had a definition of ecocide across a certain space. Did you want to talk a little bit about that? And then I've got one or two other questions just as kind of the bare bones of ecocide, and then we'll open it up for conversation.
Sure. Now, there have been different working definitions of ecocide. In terms of the broadest understanding, most people understand it to be sort of mass damage and destruction of ecosystems. That's the loosest, most sort of broad understanding. Polly's working definition, which we used for many years, and which interestingly Pope Francis also used when he called for ecocide to be made a crime in 2019. And her definition was loss, damage, or destruction of ecosystems in a given territory to the extent that the inhabitants of that territory, that the peaceful enjoyment of the inhabitants of that territory will be severely diminished. And by inhabitants, she actually implied not just humans. So there was an implication of going beyond the anthropocentric in that. And that's certainly a strong and an intuitive definition. It does have problems at the international criminal law level, in that there are some concepts in there that are simply not used in international criminal law. So peaceful enjoyment for someone from the UK, and quite possibly someone from Australia as well, because you have a bit the same common law basis, I think, as we do. I mean, anyone that's filled in a tenancy agreement for a house will know what peaceful enjoyment means. It means being allowed to get on with your life in the way that you would normally get on with your life. But that concept doesn't exist in continental law, Roman law, and that's the basis on which the Rome Statute's built. So there are, you know, there are aspects of that that don't kind of work at the international level, and there are other definitions that have been created. There was a marvelously comprehensive definition put together by French campaigner Valérie Cabanes, and some lawyers in association with her a few years ago, which did a really thorough kind of almost an overhaul of the Rome Statute, and you know, it included, I believe, the planetary boundaries and, you know, a number of other aspects. However, the sort of sheer extent of change that represented, I mean, I can't imagine any of the state representatives we're dealing with being able to even enter a discussion with something that drastic, you know, that even though it would do, you know, everything that maybe you or I would want it to do. So, you know, there's always going to be a certain degree of, you know, working out what is actually possible. The definition that interestingly exists in a few states now, so ecocide as a law does exist in a few states, mostly ex-Soviet countries in Eastern Europe, and the definition there is based on the one that was originally in the drafting of the Rome Statute, which was then the International Law Commission's code, the draft code that became the Rome Statute, and that's fairly simple, and it's a sort of the willfully causing widespread, long-term or severe damage to the natural environment. And there's a way in which that sort of trio is quite familiar in international law, the idea of what something that's widespread, long-term and severe. And so, and you know, those are terms that are certainly under discussion currently. And I think that the interesting thing about that is that it's relatively simple, but it never made. I mean, it's interesting because if we think about if that clause had actually come into effect in 20 years ago, we might be living in a very different world now. And it was prevented at the time by a number of states. So the UK, the US, France, the Netherlands, and I think on one occasion Brazil, registered at different times objections to that clause. So although we don't know how exactly when that clause was dropped out of the Rome Statute, we do know that it was an original intention to have something like that in there. And I also find it very interesting that the states that apparently got in the way are all oil states, and also at the time they were also states that were interested in nuclear testing. And of course I find it quite difficult to imagine certainly a nuclear weapon that isn't ecocidal. So one can see that could have been a serious issue. So yes, I think, I mean, I don't have an absolutely straightforward answer for you, Michelle, but that's to give a flavour of the kinds of definition that have been used in the past. And I think that in a way, the broadest definition of, or the simplest definition of serious harm to nature, the thing that we would probably add to that most often when we talk is the idea of knowledge, the idea that you knew what the risks were, but you engaged in it anyway. Now, this is in this day and age, it's very difficult to claim that you didn't know that A was going to lead to B. And in fact, I mean, the Paris Agreement is one big exercise in prior knowledge. Effectively, you know, pretty much the whole world has said, we understand that if we do a lot of A, it's going to lead to B. And so, you know, nobody can then claim they didn't know that. And of course, with direct ecosystem destruction, that's sometimes even more plain. So yes, we would say that in terms of being able to talk about this as a growing conversation, serious harm to nature, committed with knowledge of the risks, it is kind of the ballpark that we would aim for.
Thank you so much, Jojo. I'm just running through the questions here. There's a couple of different ones. I might just try to link a few together. So Trevor has asked, is ecocide helped by giving nature legal status, as with the Whanganui River in New Zealand? And as many of you know, Ayla's been involved in the rights of nature, legal personhood, sort of evolving and emerging spaces of law for quite some time. So perhaps we can have a bit of a chat together about that issue, Jojo. But what's your take on the relationship between ecocide and rights of nature?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and it comes up often. And I would say that there's a strong complementarity there. The two things are not the same, but there's a strong complementarity. And with rights of nature, you're looking, I mean, in the rights sphere, you're more in the arena of kind of civil law, and less in the arena of criminal. Whereas the other side of the coin, the sort of rights and responsibilities, so the responsibility side, it tends to lie more with criminal law. I mean, a very simple example is that as a human being, our basic human right is the right to life. But what protects the right to life is the fact that killing people is a crime. So if murder wasn't a crime, your right to life would not be very well protected in law. And so effectively, ecocide is like the protective aspect that protects the rights of nature. And we consider both to be hugely important. What we also find really interesting is that the rights of nature movement, as I'm sure Michelle can elaborate on, is hugely is growing hugely around the world at the grassroots level. And there are now many instances in different parts of the world where there are particular landscapes or natural elements like a river, a mountain, a part of a forest area and so on, that have been given legal personhood. But we don't actually have to have that in place in order to criminalize ecocide. And again, a very simple way of describing that would be simply to observe that murder was a crime centuries before human rights was even a conversation. So, so actually the simple criminalizing of an excess of harm is actually a much older and simpler, in a way, concept than the idea of rights, which is actually relatively new. So we actually believe that, again, ecocide law can almost act as a bridging piece to assist with the growth of the rights of nature, because it effectively creates, if we're saying that, damaging nature is a bad thing, then it's not such a huge step for the legal system to sort of do a much more general shift, which, because it is a much more sort of across the board shift that is potentially needed in order to acknowledge, across the board that nature has legal rights.
Excellent. Thank you, Jojo. And certainly from my point of view, I've been watching and being involved in, and I guess advocating for earth-centered law and governance of all types and all flavors. And I certainly see ecocide, rights of nature, legal personhood as all of these emerging ways of trying to push back at the systems that haven't succeeded in instilling a deep earth ethic in industrialized societies. I often say to young people I work with, I think some of the future law that we're going to be looking at will be something we've barely even dreamt of at the moment. But I do think that ecocide, rights of nature, are almost clunky but wonderfully important bridging concepts for the West to kind of wake up to itself and reinstill an earth-centered ethic, the kind of thing that many Indigenous peoples would never have to reimagine or reinvent, that they've always had this basic common sense sacralized view of the living world that supports us. So I often urge people, rather than get caught up on which one they like best, advocate for all of it and then try to apply those things into daily life and see what else you can create. And I guess I'd also like to just give a plug for the work Ayla does with our First Nations elders in Australia, because as you know, perhaps I work with Mary Graham, a Kombu Mary elder, and she talks about the phenomenal civilizational governance system that Aboriginal people had and have, built simply upon the relationist ethos. I mean, it's very deep and complex, but at its simplest form, they recognized everything as having its own autonomous regard, its own capacity to be and to be seen by others and to be respected by others, and that people only took what they needed. So for me, I'm excited to see the emergence of ecological law, earth jurisprudence, ecocide, rights of nature, and inside rights of nature, this separate branch of legal personhood for nature. And all of these things, all of them are important in terms of pushing back at the destruction of this human destructive processes and our legal system in the West that we see at the moment.
I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, I think this is it's absolutely fundamental, and we've been engaging quite a bit over the last few months with Indigenous leaders from various parts of the world, and it's so striking that you know, in some cases, you know, there's not even a reference to nature as something other at all. You know, they don't talk about protecting nature. It's about the ways of life and the completely coherent and intertwined sort of cultural understanding that is actually at the heart of things. But it's interesting though, I mean, I've come to sort of see I've come to see the evolution of the sort of Western system, this dominant system that we've got, almost with a certain amount, I know this is going to sound quite kind of strange, but a certain amount of compassion, in the sense that you know, it's not like the heads of the fossil fuel companies have sat there and said, right, how can we best destroy nature in order to get what we want? What they are the culmination of is centuries and centuries of a mindset that sets human beings apart from and above nature. And so there's almost a kind of, it's almost a logical conclusion that we've ended up where we are. And what we're actually needing to do, and I think what you just said really speaks to that, is a kind of a re-education program, actually, you know, is because actually, I mean, if you, and I'm sure that, and I know the people who are engaged in wild law in various ways have done exactly this, taking people out into nature and having them put their feet on the ground and actually kind of do a kind of, you know, an exercise in reconnection, because, you know, we are hugely impoverished. We're hugely impoverished in the Western mindset by the fact that we do feel so separate. And you can trace this back. There's a wonderful book by a chap called Jeremy Lent, which I recommend to anybody, called The Patterning Instinct, which looks right back to, you know, the Greek philosophers, you know, on which our kind of system of thinking, you know, where it has its roots. You know, when you're looking at Plato, where he's got this kind of ideal versus the real, and the ideal is obviously then, I mean, even the word, we use ideal as something that we strive towards, right? So you've got this kind of dichotomy here, and then, you know, you move through to the centuries where the Catholic Church dominated, and, you know, St. Augustine and so on, and you're looking at, again, this incredible split, the spirit versus the body, and the body is the bad thing and the spirit is the good thing. And then you keep moving forward, and you literally almost go straight into the Enlightenment thinking, where it's reason and it's intellect that are sort of valued above anything to do with emotion, anything to do with nature, anything to do with the feminine, all of these things. And so there's this kind of really deeply culturally embedded, you know, separation that actually means that, you know, I mean, I would say that, you know, the richness of life is so impoverished by this, but that doesn't mean that there aren't aspects of that have also benefited, you know, huge numbers of people hugely around the world. And it's like, it's almost like what we need to be looking at now is, how can we reintegrate? How can we re-educate? And how can we reintegrate and take the best of that sort of incredibly precise, clear scientific thinking and use it in support of life, instead of as a kind of somehow as a barrier to us actually even connecting with the natural world. I mean, Polly used to do this thing, and I do it as well. We did it for years together, actually, is literally grounding every day, taking our shoes off and going and standing on the earth. Because when it comes down to it, our bodies and the body of the earth are deeply and profoundly connected. And all of this work that we're doing around, you know, earth laws, around earth jurisprudence, the rights of nature, ecocide, this is all about the body. It's all about the body of the earth. It's all about the health of that and the sacredness of that. And there is absolutely no reason why those things should be put in opposition to each other. They're not in opposition to each other. It's purely a question of deeply embedded perception.
Yeah, no, and we agree. There's so much that we do in the sort of the philosophical, ethical, cultural, internal ways of working. And then there's where we explore the joys of legal tools, which brings a set of questions, that some folks have asked. And thanks for your questions, everyone. I've been collating them whilst listening to Jojo. There's a couple of questions that kind of link together around the definition aspects again, Jojo. Jane has asked or said, under the broad definition, the law would be completely unimplementable. There must be a consideration of scale and an identification of agents. I might just rattle through a couple of these, Jojo, and then speak to the definitional issues. only got one half of that question. Alex has asked a terrific question. I assume the law would cover marine ecosystems within territories, but what about the high seas? My assumption is that ecocide law would cover that as well. And what tools in law will the laws of ecocide have? This is a question from Sasha. Will the laws of ecocide have to challenge governments watering down ecological data for the sake of development? Much of the damage to nature and the natural environment is being caused by the doctoring of existing environmental laws. So we've got three questions there that kind of link to the specifics and the thresholds. And I know you can't answer all of them, but what are people thinking at the moment about some of those?
So yes, firstly to do with the, I'll take those in order. So firstly to do with the breadth of the definition. Now, whoever asked that question is obviously absolutely right in the sense that it will actually need to have a level of precision to it, because it'll be impossible to actually cover, everything that sort of broad definition potentially covers. So that's what, that is literally one of the things that the drafting panel is wrestling with in terms of how do we make that precise. And I think certainly with our particular direction at the international level, we have to look at the most serious instances, the most egregious instances, so that effectively, so that we're sort of setting the bar. It can't be, we don't want to set it so high that it's not possible to prosecute. And actually, an example of that would be genocide, where you actually have to prove intent to destroy in whole or in part a people. And that's actually very, very difficult to do, in the same way as sort of willfully is very difficult to prove, for example. So that perhaps might be too high a bar. At the same time, you need it to be high enough for it to be, to use the colloquial term, for it to be a kind of a no-brainer for states, because what you want is you want them to look at the definition and to go, God, you're absolutely right, that should be a crime. Not to be looking at it thinking, well, we do a bit of that and we do a bit of that and we do a bit of that. Oh dear, I don't know if we can agree to that. So, so there is a way in which this is a kind of a sort of narrowing down exercise. And I think, we won't know exactly how that emerges until the definition emerges in June, but we absolutely acknowledge that that's a serious and a key issue. With the high seas issue, of course, there are areas of the high seas that are completely outside any national jurisdiction. It does make it important, therefore, that this is an international crime, and that doesn't necessarily, it may not be completely straightforward exactly how this applies to the high seas in the absolute terms of the crime. But what we do have is, as you'll probably be aware, the principles of universal jurisdiction, or sometimes called universal competence. So long as a crime exists, those principles can be used to apply to extra jurisdictional territories. So there is a way in which ecocide as an international crime gives potential access to those areas of extra jurisdictional or global commons areas that don't fall within national territories. So it is a little bit of a sort of combinatory approach, but it does allow for that possibility in a way that national laws don't. And then finally, the environmental data one, I think this is fascinating, because one of the things that I believe will happen, and is beginning to happen, but I think will happen more and more, is that the bodies which report environmental data, investigate environmental data, and look at compliance with environmental regulation, I believe this is going to be a huge growth area in the next 10 years, because just again, and this comes down again to the power of the conversation around this, what it's going to, in a small way, we saw it in Europe a couple of years ago with the data protection regulations that came in the sense that, there was a sort of deadline at which, all companies had to comply with these particular data protection regulations. And what happened in the approach to that was all of these kind of, different bodies and different companies and different, all kind of sprang up to look at, how do you approach this? How do you quantify it? How do you, it's just one very specific and relatively small area. But I believe that in the environmental regulation area, this is absolutely going to mushroom. And it will also, the scrutiny will also become far higher. at the governmental level. So, I mean, I can't give you a very hugely precise answer to that, but I have to say that I think it's a very important area, and I think it's one that's going to be growing at an astronomical rate in the next 10 years. And I think we will inevitably see improvements as a result of that. So yeah, I mean, I'm very hopeful in that area. I can already see, discussions starting to happen around this. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jojo. You're right. That is a very fascinating area. I've got a question from Lena about how many companies would be in the direct firing line of ecocide laws? Is there a list?
That's one to put us on the spot, isn't it? I think, I mean, this kind of speaks again to that question that is often asked is, who will you see in the dock? Who's going to be your first prosecution? Now, I have to say that even if I did list a number of companies now, I think what we would, our response to that is ideally we don't want to see anyone in the dock. And that's where the transition period comes in, because the whole idea, in a sense, is to say that, this far and no further. And if you think if your activities are taking you close to this line, you're going to need to start, reevaluating how it is that you do what you do. And there are some obvious, instances around the world that are kind of almost no-brainers in terms of what might an ecocide be. I mean, the situation in the Ogoni Delta in Nigeria, for example, the scale of destruction in the Amazon rainforest is another one. And I mean, some of these are easier to pin down to certain perpetrators than others, but I mean, for me, deep sea bottom trawling is a major one, and potentially deep sea mining. I mean, there are these areas where what's going to need to happen is that those sectors are going to need to reevaluate very carefully two things. One, the scale at which they operate, and two, the methods. So, we're not going to instantly see overnight, an immediate total switch to renewable energy, regenerative farming, circular economy, but we're going to see those things sitting on a much more level playing field and able to move forward in a much more positive way, while those sort of bad actors, if you like, that have not been restricted have to reevaluate what they're doing. Because the other thing is, of course, they're externalizing their costs. So actually at the moment, I mean, I'll just give a simple example from agriculture. At the moment, we pay probably, hugely over the odds to get, for example, organic food in the supermarket. But that is because the actual costs of producing factory farm food are not actually factored into the price. So, so there are elements like that will start to change. And my personal feeling is that the whole way that we kind of shop for our lives, if you like, in terms of food and in terms of supplies, in terms of clothing, all of this will actually change quite a bit. Because I think what will happen is that we will end up with a gradual, hopefully not too gradual, but certainly a gradual shift towards the real costs being reflected in the production of goods, and quite possibly the losing of a number of the middlemen that we see. Because if you think about it, we now have with the online potential and sort of and we've seen it over COVID, the sort of where you have kind of online shopping and delivery, you're literally removing 2 or 3 steps and 2 or 3 levels of profit from the economic system, so that I fully predict a time when food will be, you'll either order it or you'll get it from a local market, locally produced. Because those sort of interim steps, those costs will be better reflected at the production end because of the actual costs of properly growing those things in a way that doesn't damage the environment. Anyway, I went on a bit of a tangent there. I don't often get to answer that question, so that was nice.
No. And for those of us looking at systems change and looking at all the different elements and all the different disciplines that are engaging in what we would call an earth-centered way forward, you're exactly right. Certain things will trigger system change. And I think the thing we do have to be careful of, though, is it seems that capitalism and those who are really keen to continue the accumulative capitalist mode are very, very creative in responding to every new thing that's created to try to push back at that system. So I think the only thing that gives me optimism is the sheer volume of people working on the sheer range of things around the planet, whether it's donut economics, planetary boundaries and the science, the law, the ecocide, the rights of nature. There's so many pressure points now pushing that you can only hope that it all does lead to a better reflection of creating that relationship with the living world. Thank you, Jojo. We're not finished with you yet. There's a question, I'm not sure if you can answer this, so forgive us if it's not entirely relevant, but John has asked, can you give us your thoughts on the plight of Rob Donziger, the lawyer who took on Chevron on behalf of the Amazon folks and won and is now under house arrest? If that's not
actually, well, no, funnily enough, I'm in regular communication with him. So Steve, it's actually Stephen Donziger. Yes, it's a fascinating situation because he and Pablo Fajardo in Ecuador, and Pablo is actually a member of our drafting panel for Ecocide. They had such a clear victory that was vindicated by a number of different courts, and yet what we've seen, obviously, in the case of Chevron is they've employed a huge is actually a huge number of expensive lawyers to somehow keep that judgment from being carried out. And one of the things that obviously we're not directly involved in that. I mean, in terms of what we're doing, we're in communication with him because we're obviously hugely in solidarity. But one of the things that I think, again, Ecocide, if we imagine if Ecocide law had been in place when that case was being taken, we might have ended up with a rather different situation. And so I think that there's a very obvious case of long-term intimidation that's happened there that is kind of it's partly enabled by the fact that it's Chevron as a corporation that was the subject of that court case, whereas potentially with a criminal law in place where you have an actual individual, I think we might have seen quite a different evolution of that story. Also because one of the key differences between civil litigation and criminal law is that with criminal law it's the state that prosecutes. With civil litigation you're talking about pitting yourself or a small community or a group directly against another player, whereas with criminal law, I mean, in theory at least, you tap a policeman on the shoulder and say, I'd like to report an ecocide, and then the state prosecutes. I mean, obviously I very much look forward to the day when that's the case, but yes, I think certainly the two things are have relevance to each other, but obviously I can't speak more directly on his specific case other than to say that we are hugely sympathetic and in solidarity and communication with him.
One question that actually pops up a lot when we discuss Ecocide is pretty much what you've just touched on. Ecocide as a criminal law is still embedded in the nation state system. So it's the government that can take the case against. What happens when you have governments who, well, let's put the question another way. In Australia, a lot of environmental harm is first and foremost approved through leasing or through licensing by the government. What do you do if in an imaginary future we have some access to ecocide laws in Australia, but it's actually the governments who are allowing the leasing and the water extraction on the Darling River, for example? What does Ecocide have to say about government responsibility?
Okay, so there's two aspects here. One is that with that law in place, obviously it would, this also speaks to the ratification process at the ICC, because every member state doesn't have to ratify a new amendment. So effectively, it could be that I very much hope Australia would ratify the amendment, but let's say it didn't, then that law, as decided at the ICC, wouldn't apply in Australia. So you could potentially end up with a situation that you're describing. What criminalizing at the international level does give the opportunity for, and again, this combines with the universal jurisdiction principle, is that the prosecution doesn't have to happen in the country where the crime is happening. It can happen either at the ICC itself, if it's considered that the state can't or won't prosecute, and that can be reported then to the ICC directly as a court of last resort. But it's not only the ICC that can prosecute. Any ratifying state can also prosecute that crime, as long as some kind of connection can be made with that state. So, for example, you might have I mean, I'm literally just making this up. So, this is not something to be quoted in the press or what have you, but just as an example, you could have an Australian company, or you could have, I don't know, let's say an Indian company that's operating in Australia and creating ecocidal effects in Australia, but it has an operational office in, say, Belgium. At that point, if Belgium ratifies the crime, Belgium can prosecute in Belgium. So, so there is a certain extending of the possibilities of prosecution that happens once you criminalize at the international level. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is simply that, let's say in the best case, Australia does ratify that crime, they will be looking at the licenses they approve. They will be looking for those licenses to comply with that law. So, in a sense, the problem is reduced massively, if not completely negated, if Australia does sign up to the crime, because they will then have to obey their own, what their own national, legislation has brought in.
Yes, and what I'm thinking of is the cumulative impact of massive cotton and other irrigation uses at the top of our longest river system, which is damn near dead. And I think looking at those corporations who have been permitted by governments to have those licenses, anyway, there's lots to think about. So, hey, we've only got 5 minutes left, and the one question I've saved to the end, because I think it's a nice call to ask, is a lovely question from Nikki T. What can we do here in Australia to best support and promote the Ecocide campaign? She said she's approached the Byron Bay Council about becoming an earth protected town. Do you think promoting this throughout local councils in Australia is the fastest way to spread the word? And of course, feel free to launch forth in musical tones about the new Stop Ecocide.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, so I was going to say, so first off, obviously find out how you can support the new Australian branch of Stop Ecocide. And so there's actually probably sort of three things here. So one is the Earth Protected Town thing, which is actually, we have a sort of a UK charity that's a sort of sister initiative that has been kind of seeding this a bit in different parts of the world, looks at a kind of framework that they've been developing with our own hometown as a model, a framework for institutions, municipalities, schools, all sorts of different organizations to potentially approach a sort of regenerative way of doing things, with particularly the idea of ecocide law in mind, as in what would we need to do to behave as if this law were already in place? How would we behave differently? And that's a wonderful initiative, and it's one that could be taken up in local communities. It does involve quite a lot of sort of thinking through and community collaboration and all of those things. If you're looking for a very straightforward way and simple, fast way to support this conversation at the local council level, simply putting a motion through your local council that says this council supports the idea of supports the criminalization of ecocide at the national and international levels. If you have lots of local councils doing that, you've got a very powerful thing to put in front of the government there. To say, all of these local councils have said this is what they support. What are you going to do about it? That's actually quite, politically speaking, that's a much faster. It's less practical in terms of how a community would approach, which I think is absolutely wonderful thing to do, was encourage anyone to do it. But politically, that's probably the fastest way to move forward on the political side. But the third thing, and everybody can do this in whatever networks they have, and we all have networks, big and small, and that is simply to talk about ecocide. I mean, it sounds really simple, but actually, as we talked about earlier, the word itself has this incredible traction. And so simply using the word to describe serious damage to nature in itself helps move that conversation forward, both at the local and at the international level. So we would hugely encourage that. And of course, we have a number of fantastic materials, whether that's sort of flyers and placards and all those sort of things. So as the the restrictions open up around COVID and things are actually able to take place in person, then we have plenty of opportunities for you to sort of make that very visible.
Yeah, that's terrific, Jojo. Thanks so much. So what I'd like to do now is just start to wrap it up. I'm wondering if Christina or John could post the social media platforms for Stop Ecocide Australia into our comments, the chat section, please. I went looking for them, but you're in charge and I can't find them. So yay for me. You've got the Instagram there. And I've already put in the website for Stop Ecocide, the international website, and also AILA's website. So from AILA's point of view, we will be exploring the rather horrific impacts of the 2019-2020 bushfires in a People's Tribunal in June. And we'll actually be asking, has the Australian government's failure to care for country actually contributed to ecocide in that instance? So we'll be exploring definitions of ecocide. Jojo will be coming back as one of our kind of guest speakers to give a testimony about where ecocide's up to. More information about that can be found on our website, but there'll be a lot more info coming out next week. It won't be focusing on the international campaign. It will be exploring what ecocide looks like in the Australian context, as well as drawing on Indigenous cultural fire burning and a whole range of other scientific and local people's testimonies about what happened and how things can be different in the future. But the only other thing I'll give a plug for is we've got another webinar on the 11th of May. AILA has a monthly webinar series, a series of monthly webinars. On the 11th of May, we've got the remarkable Dr. Anne Polina from the Kimberley talking about an introduction to first laws. And what I'm just posting in here now is information about a workshop that AILA runs with Future Dreaming, our Indigenous sister organisation. And if anyone's interested in some of that work, please do look us up, say hello, get in touch. And if you're keen to join a workshop and you're a bit broke, let us know. We actually charge money for our Future Dreaming ones because it supports the work of our Indigenous elders who are stretched to the limits in a lot of the work that they do. But that's my little plug for the Australian Earth Laws Alliance and the emerging and fabulous Stop Ecocide International Australia branch. I don't have much of anything else to say except a huge thank you to Jojo for always saying yes whenever we invite her to come and have a yarn to the Aussie gang. So thank you, Jojo, for your expertise and your wonderful passion for all of these issues. We're just so excited to be connected with you and working even more closely with you into the future. So absolutely. Perhaps if people would like to it's late, I need dinner. Press the clapping button or do some airtime. Thank you. So it's an anticlimax at the end of a webinar because you often can't hear people, but thank you so much.
Well, if people want to unmute just to say bye-bye, that can be nice. Yes. But yeah, no, really lovely to be with you all today. And yeah, have a fantastic evening. And I'm sure this will be an ongoing conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Jojo.
Bye.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everyone.
Thanks,
Jojo.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, everyone. See you all.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.